I still remember the sound of the rain that night in Richmond, soft, steady, almost apologetic against the windows of that small apartment I once called mine. It was the kind of rain that usually soothed me, but not that evening. Not when my parents stood in the doorway with their coats still dripping, their faces set in the kind of solemn determination they reserved for decisions they had already made without me. My father didn't sit. He just stood there, blocking the light, his voice low and heavy as he said Andrew needed the place more than I did, that his new business couldn't wait, that family required sacrifice. I was 25 then, old enough to recognize the tone of a man who considered the matter closed before the conversation even began. My mother offered a soft explanation, something about opportunity, something about Andrew's future. Her hands were folded tightly at her waist, the way she held them when she was hiding the tremor in her fingers. She didn't look at me when she said it would only be temporary. They never did look at me when they wanted me to be small. I should have asked more questions. I should have put my foot down. But I was still the quiet son then, the one who'd learned early that speaking up only invited a colder silence. So I packed a single duffel bag while they waited in the hallway. I handed over the keys that still felt warm from my palm. And when Andrew showed up 20 minutes later, smiling wide, already talking about measurements and equipment setups, I stepped aside like a guest in my own life. I spent the next 3 months sleeping in a friend's garage on a cot that sagged toward the middle. The air smelled of old lumber and motor oil, and every night the cold settled into my bones a little deeper. I told people it was temporary. I told myself it was temporary. I don't know whether I believed it or whether I was simply afraid of what it would mean if I didn't. The truth surfaced slowly, in pieces. An overdue notice I'd never seen before. A phone call from a lender asking about equipment I didn't own. A sudden drop in my credit score that made my stomach tighten. By the time I traced it all back, the damage was already done. The business they'd spoken of so solemnly was nothing more than a collection of purchases made in my name. Machines I'd never touched, accounts I'd never opened, contracts bearing a handwriting so close to mine it made me feel sick. I confronted no one. Not then. Not when the truth first broke open. I simply absorbed it the way I had absorbed every other quiet blow before it. Silently, inwardly, turning understanding into a kind of numb resignation. But something inside me shifted that year. A small crack opened, almost imperceptible. The beginning of a fracture I didn't yet know would one day split my entire life in two. Looking back now, 5 years later, I can still feel that cold Richmond rain on my face. I can still see my father's silhouette in the doorway, solid and unyielding. I can still hear the faint, defeated way I said, "Okay. If it's for Andrew." It was the last time I surrendered anything without a fight. I turned 30 alone. Not in the dramatic sense people imagine when they hear that word. No empty bar stool. No dramatic stare into a drink. Just a quiet room and a folding table pressed against the wall of a sublet I didn't intend to stay in. Greensboro wasn't home yet. It was just where I'd landed after Richmond, after the garage, after learning how quickly stability can evaporate when it was never truly yours to begin with. I cooked myself dinner that night. Pasta, nothing fancy. I remember the sound of the water boiling, the hum of the refrigerator, the way the clock over the sink seemed louder than usual. Midnight came and went without ceremony. No cake, no knock on the door. Just the faint acknowledgement that another year had passed and somehow I had survived it. The phone rang at 12:16. I knew it was my father before I answered. I always did. He never called at odd hours unless he wanted something, and when he did, the urgency was never about connection, it was about control. I hesitated longer than I should have, watching the screen vibrate against the cheap laminate countertop. Then I picked up. He didn't say my name. He didn't say happy birthday. He was already shouting, his voice sharp and panicked, the words tumbling over each other as if time itself were collapsing. He said my mother was dying. Said she was in a hospital in Raleigh. Said something had gone wrong. Something sudden, something catastrophic. He said the doctors wouldn't operate until they had $50,000 up front. Not tomorrow. Not eventually. Now, I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, the way you do when you think maybe you've misheard something too large to absorb all at once. I asked where she was. What hospital? What happened? He didn't answer any of it. He just repeated the number, 50,000, over and over like a command, like a test. He said they'd tried Andrew already, but he wasn't liquid enough. He said this was family. He said this was life or death. He said if she died, it would be on my conscience. Still, not once did he ask how I was. Not once did he ask where I lived. Not once did he acknowledge that it was my birthday. I felt something strange happen in my chest then. Not fear, not guilt, but a sudden, startling clarity. Like a room going silent after a loud machine shuts off. I realized how familiar this pattern was. How perfectly rehearsed. Crisis, pressure, shame, compliance. I thought of the garage, the keys, the equipment bought in my name, the debts I was still untangling quietly, methodically, alone. I thought of the way my father had said Andrew needed the apartment more. I thought of how often family had only flowed in one direction. My voice didn't rise when I spoke. That surprised me most of all. I told him I didn't have that kind of money. He exploded, accused me of lying, accused me of hoarding, accused me of being selfish at the exact moment my mother needed me most. He said I'd regret this for the rest of my life. He said no one would ever forgive me. I waited for the familiar tightening in my stomach, the reflex to explain, to justify, to surrender. It didn't come. Instead, I said something I had never said to him before. I told him to ask his perfect son. There was a pause then. Not silence, but a stunned gap where his anger stalled, unable to process resistance from the place he least expected it. I heard my own breathing in the receiver, slow and steady, grounding me in a way I wasn't used to. Then he swore at me, and I hung up. I sat there afterward, phone still in my hand, waiting for the guilt to hit. It always had before. A crushing, familiar weight that bent every decision back toward obedience. But this time it didn't arrive. What I felt instead was relief, clean and unsettling. Like stepping outside after being underwater too long. For the first time in my life, I had not folded under the sound of his voice. I had not rushed to prove my worth through sacrifice. I went to bed shortly after, expecting sleep to evade me the way it usually did on nights like that. Instead, I slept deeply, dreamless, uninterrupted, as if my body recognized something my mind was only beginning to understand. The phone rang again at 8:42 the next morning. This time, it wasn't my father. It was a detective from Winston-Salem. He spoke calmly, professionally, the way men do when they're about to tell you something that will permanently alter the shape of your life. He said my name carefully, as if testing it for accuracy. He said documents had been filed overnight under my identity. He said my presence was requested to clarify a situation involving potential fraud. I sat on the edge of the bed, the echo of my father's panic still faint in my ears, and finally understood what that midnight call had really been. Not desperation, preparation. And for the first time since everything began, I knew with absolute certainty that saying no had been the right thing. The police station in Winston-Salem was quieter than I expected. Not the cinematic kind of quiet, no tension humming in the air, no sharp glances or raised voices, just the muted stillness of a government building that had seen too many ordinary disasters to dramatize any of them. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. A wall clock ticked with dull persistence. The smell was antiseptic and old coffee. I gave my name at the front desk and was told to wait. Sitting there, hands folded loosely in my lap, I had time to feel the weight of what was unfolding. Not panic, that came later, but something heavier and colder. A sense that I had already crossed a line I could not step back over, whether I wanted to or not. A man in plain clothes approached me after several minutes. Mid-40s, tired eyes, posture of someone who had long ago stopped being impressed by excuses. He introduced himself as Detective Harris and led me down a narrow hallway into a small interview room. There was no glass mirror, no recording light, just a table, 3 chairs, and a manila folder placed carefully in the center, squared to the edge as if precision itself mattered here. He didn't sit right away. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to be clear, you're not under arrest. You're not a suspect at this time. But there are documents filed overnight that involve your identity, your financial accounts, and forged signatures. He paused, watching my face. Do you understand why that concerns us? I nodded. He sat down then and opened the folder. The first thing he slid across the table was a still frame from hospital security footage. It took my eyes a second to register what I was seeing. The lighting too harsh, the angle too wide, and then recognition landed hard and unmistakable. My father, standing at a reception desk. Beside him, Andrew. They were leaning in close to a nurse, papers spread between them. My father's posture was familiar, authoritative, insistent, the same posture he'd used my entire life to turn his certainty into compliance. The timestamp glowed in the corner. 12:41 a.m. Less than 30 minutes after he'd called me. Detective Harris slid another image forward. A closer angle this time. Andrew holding a pen. My father pointing to a line on the page. Those are emergency consent forms, Harris said evenly. Authorization documents tied to financial responsibility. The hospital flagged them because the accounts listed didn't match the patient. My throat tightened. What patient? I asked. Harris looked at me carefully. That's the thing, he said. There was no patient. Your mother was never admitted. She never checked in. No ambulance was dispatched. No operating room was prepared. He let that sit. The medical crisis was fabricated. The words didn't hit me all at once. They came in waves, disbelief first, then anger, then something closer to grief. Not for my mother's health, but for the final, undeniable confirmation of who my family truly was when they thought no one was watching. Harris continued, methodical and calm. The forms your father and brother submitted listed you as the financially responsible party. The signatures were convincing, good enough to pass a casual glance, but not good enough to survive scrutiny. He turned the folder toward me and laid out copies of the documents. My name, my handwriting, or something close enough to it that my stomach lurched when I saw it. I stared at the looping curve of the capital letters, the pressure marks mimicked almost perfectly, the spacing just slightly off in ways only someone who knew me well could manage. How long? I asked quietly. Harris exhaled through his nose and leaned back slightly. That's where this gets extensive. He opened a second folder. Inside were documents spanning years, utility bills, credit applications, repair invoices, short-term loans, vendor agreements. All signed in that same practiced imitation. Some dated back to when I was 17. I felt my hands curl into fists without realizing it. They started early, Harris said. Small amounts at first. Things unlikely to trigger alerts. Over time, the frequency increased. The amounts increased. The confidence increased. I thought of how often I'd been told I was bad with money. How often I'd been warned that I didn't understand responsibility the way Andrew did. How easily that narrative had been reinforced when numbers didn't add up and I blamed myself. There's more, Harris said. He slid his phone across the table and tapped the screen. A family group chat opened, one I had never been part of. Names I recognized. Conversations I had never seen. They spoke about timing, about pressure, about what story to tell if lenders called. They referred to me in the third person, as if I were a liability rather than a son. One message stopped my breath entirely. He's the weakest link. No one will believe him anyway. I read it twice, then a third time. Something inside me went very still. Detective Harris watched me closely but said nothing. He didn't need to. That sentence had done what years of manipulation never could. It erased the last trace of illusion I had been carrying. They assumed, Harris said finally, that you wouldn't push back, that you'd absorb the damage quietly, that if things collapsed, the narrative would hold. What narrative? I asked. That you were irresponsible, that you mismanaged funds, that you were unstable. We've seen it before. I leaned back in the chair, exhaustion settling into my bones. What happens now? I asked. Harris folded his hands. Now they're suspects. Fraud, identity theft, conspiracy. And you? He paused, choosing his words carefully. You're cleared, fully. But I want to be honest with you. When people realize control is slipping, they tend to escalate. As if summoned by the idea itself, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Harris noticed. "Don't answer it," he said quietly. "Not yet." I nodded. As I stood to leave, the weight of the room shifted. I wasn't walking out vindicated or victorious, not yet, but I was walking out awake. Fully, irrevocably awake. Outside, the afternoon light felt sharper, less forgiving. I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine, staring at the steering wheel like it belonged to someone else. For years, my name had been a tool they used. That day, it became evidence. And somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion and anger, I felt the first steady pulse of something I hadn't known before. Freedom. The weeks that followed moved with a strange, disjointed rhythm. Part investigation, part reckoning, part quiet unraveling of a story I thought I already understood. Every few days, Detective Harris called with updates. His tone never changed. Calm, precise, almost apologetic, as if he knew each new fact would land like another weight added to a scale already tipping. What they uncovered wasn't just theft. It was architecture. A system built slowly, deliberately, over years, not out of desperation but entitlement. They hadn't panicked and stolen from me when things went wrong. They had planned to use me long before anything ever did. Harris walked me through it one afternoon in a small conference room, sunlight slicing through the blinds and striping the table like bars. He laid the documents out chronologically this time, and seeing them ordered that way changed everything. It told a story with a beginning, a middle, and an intent. The first fraudulent account had been opened when I was 19. A minor credit line, a store card, paid on time, closed quietly. No damage, no alarms. A test. Then another. Then another. Utility accounts in cities I'd never lived in. Equipment rentals tied to Andrew's projects. Repair invoices for properties I'd never stepped foot inside. Each one bearing my name. Each one reinforcing a narrative that painted me as scattered, unreliable, careless with obligations. They were laundering responsibility, Harris said. Using your identity to normalize the idea that you were financially erratic. I stared at the papers, my own forged signature repeating like a cruel echo. Every time I'd been lectured about responsibility. Every time my father had sighed and said Andrew just handled things better. Every time my mother had quietly asked whether I was keeping track of my finances. It wasn't concern. It was cover. The group chat filled in the gaps the paperwork couldn't. Messages stretched back years. Planning, coordination, reminders to delete threads to keep stories straight. Andrew asked when to push harder. My father advised patience. My mother played mediator, softening language, suggesting emotional leverage instead of confrontation. One message, dated 2 years earlier, made my hands tremble. If he ever pushes back, we pivot. Say he's stressed, overworked. He's always been sensitive. Sensitive. That word followed me my entire life like a diagnosis I never consented to. The detective paused as I read, giving me space I didn't know I needed. He didn't rush me. He didn't soften the truth. He let it settle fully, completely. What gets me, I said finally, my voice lower than I expected, is how much effort this took. Harris nodded. People don't do this accidentally, he said. This wasn't survival. This was strategy. By the third week, the scope of the damage was clear. Hundreds of thousands in fraudulent activity. A paper trail so dense it required a task force to unwind. Lenders were notified. Accounts frozen. Alerts issued in my name, this time to protect me. For the first time, institutions believed me without hesitation. That alone felt surreal. Then the calls started. At first, they were cautious. Missed calls. Voicemails left in neutral tones, pretending nothing had changed. My mother asked if I was okay. Andrew texted asking why I hadn't returned my father's call. My father left a voicemail that said only my name, drawn out, heavy with implication. I didn't respond. When silence failed, pressure followed. They showed up unannounced one night just after sunset. I heard the pounding before I saw them. Sharp, furious knocks that rattled the doorframe. I stood in my living room, the small Greensboro apartment finally feeling like mine, and watched the security camera feed on my phone. My father paced. Andrew stood too close to the door. My mother hovered behind them, wringing her hands. They shouted my name. They demanded explanations. They accused me of betrayal. I didn't answer. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Someone across the courtyard started recording. I could see the red dot on a phone screen glowing like a warning. That changed everything. The tone shifted. My father straightened his posture. Andrew stepped back. My mother began crying. Real tears or tactical ones? I couldn't tell anymore. They left shortly after. The next morning, Harris called. They contacted a lender trying to claim you're mentally unstable, he said. That didn't go anywhere. But I want you to be prepared. They're scrambling. A few days later, we all sat in the same police room. Not together, not yet, but in sequence. I heard them before I saw them. Raised voices. Denials. My father insisting this was a misunderstanding. Andrew blaming stress. My mother crying again. Then it was my turn. I sat calmly as recordings played, as documents were displayed, as timelines aligned with timestamps and signatures and messages they could no longer explain away. No one looked at me. They didn't need to. The evidence spoke with a clarity none of us ever had. When Harris told them they were being named suspects, something in the room collapsed. Not dramatically, quietly, like a structure giving up under its own weight. I wasn't triumphant when I walked out. I was lighter. The life they'd built on my silence, the assumptions, the control, the unspoken hierarchy was finished. Not because I'd fought louder, but because I'd finally stopped absorbing what was never mine to carry. Outside, the sky was pale and open. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, breathing in the space where guilt used to live. For the first time, my name wasn't something they could use. It was mine. The final confrontation didn't happen the way I once imagined it might have. No shouting match, no dramatic accusations hurled across a room, no moment where I finally said everything I'd been holding in. By the time it arrived, words felt unnecessary. The truth had already done the work I never could. We were brought into the same room late on a Thursday afternoon. A neutral space, gray walls, a long table, chairs arranged with careful distance. No one sat close enough to touch. That felt intentional. Separation wasn't just physical anymore. It was permanent. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Not weaker exactly, just diminished. The certainty that had once anchored his posture was gone, replaced by a restless tension in his shoulders. Andrew avoided my eyes entirely. My mother stared at her hands, twisting a tissue until it tore. I felt calm. That surprised me. I had expected anger to surge or bitterness, or the long-delayed urge to demand explanations. Instead, there was a quiet steadiness in my chest, the kind that comes when something has already ended, and all that's left is acknowledgement. Detective Harris spoke first, outlining what had already been established. Fraud, identity theft, conspiracy. The words landed with bureaucratic weight, stripped of emotion. Evidence was reviewed again. Signatures, messages, timelines. No room for interpretation. No room for narrative. My father interrupted once. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said, voice tight. "Families handle things internally. This didn't need to become this." Harris didn't raise his voice. "It became this when documents were forged and money was taken under false pretenses," he said. "Intent matters. Duration matters. And both are present here." Andrew finally looked up then. "He would have helped," he said suddenly, gesturing toward me without fully meeting my gaze. "If we just asked. He always helps." I looked at him for a long moment before responding. When I spoke, my voice was even. "You didn't ask," I said. "You decided." The room went quiet. My mother began to cry again. Softer this time, worn down, like tears that had lost their edge. She said she hadn't meant for it to go this far. She said she just wanted to keep the family together. She said she was scared. I believed her. But belief no longer meant absolution. Harris concluded the meeting with procedural next steps. Lawyers would be involved. Charges pending review. Protective measures finalized for my identity and credit. It was all very orderly, very final. When we stood to leave, my father turned toward me as if expecting something. Forgiveness, maybe, or at least familiarity. I offered neither. I nodded once, politely, the way you do to a stranger whose story you already know. Outside, the evening air was cool and clean. I stood alone on the steps for a moment, watching my parents and brother walk away together, their voices low and urgent. They clustered instinctively, as if proximity could undo what had been exposed. Couldn't. In the days that followed, my phone stayed quiet. No more calls demanding explanations. No more messages framed as concern but sharpened with expectation. Lenders contacted me directly, to apologize, to confirm corrections, to restore what had been damaged. Credit alerts faded into normalcy. My name, once scattered across liabilities I didn't choose, began to settle back into something whole. I changed my locks. I closed old accounts. I opened new ones with a sense of intention I'd never had before. One afternoon, weeks later, I sat at the same folding table where I'd answered my father's call on my 30th birthday. The apartment felt different now. Not larger, not grander, but solid. Earned. The walls held no echoes of obligation. I thought about what had been taken from me over the years, not just money, but certainty, safety, the belief that family was a refuge rather than a risk. I thought about what remained. Peace, I realized, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, like a door closing behind you without regret. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. The life they built on my silence was over. And the life I was building, slowly, deliberately, required no permission from anyone else. For the first time, my name belonged to me alone.